Hi. In this unit, what I want to look at is how conflicts are resolved. Every one of us will, as a manager, eventually face a situation where different groups disagree strongly with each other, and we are responsible for resolving that conflict, for finding a resolution to those disagreements. We've all done this before, as throughout our lives. We've had friends who got in fights and where we've tried to help them resolve those issues, or found ourselves personally strongly disagreeing with someone else and being forced to resolve those issues. In an organizational management setting, it can be more complex, however, and functionally, as a manager, we remain responsible for finding a resolution. We can't often simply walk away from the problem. So in this unit, I want to look at some of the approaches and some of the thought processes that we use in resolving conflict. One of the things to remember, we sometimes hear the idea of a conflict described as a difference of opinion. Two people or two groups of people differ in their opinion of what should happen. Fair enough, but it's often much deeper and stronger than that. One or more groups may feel deeply threatened by the conflict. In other words, it's not just that I disagree with you about your opinion, I can't accept your approach because it will hurt me physically, emotionally, organizationally, in some way. My interests or the interests of my group are threatened. You can't really understand my opinion without also understanding my interests. Now, when we talk about conflict resolution, two basic approaches. Competition, which is arm wrestling. One of us will win, and we are going to exercise strength and power to determine who that is. Or cooperation, sometimes known as collaboration. This is a model where we're going to work toward a solution where both parties gain something, and they gain at least, they have a win in terms of at least some of their interests. This is a more complex process, but it's typically in organizational settings inherently more satisfying and productive. So when we look at a competition model, this is typically based on something called win-lose. Win-lose, one of us will win and the other will lose. Winner take all. The winner gets their way, has their interests addressed and supported. The loser does not. This is the way wars work. This is the way a lot of corporate takeover models work. It tends to ignore or not require us to understand the interests of both sides well. We know our own interests, we see those as paramount, and we do everything in our power to support our interests regardless of what happens to the interests of our opponent. This tends to be the first choice that most people choose. If you think about the way we're brought up, we grow up playing games where one team wins and the other team loses. And if you score a point, you win, and if you don't score a point, you lose. It's that simple. And we tend to see things that way. Human beings typically resort to competition faced with these sorts of challenges. So this one's often the most common, not often the most effective. A cooperation or collaboration approach is based on win-win. Each of us needs a win. Each side is entitled to something. This requires both sides to understand both sets of interests quite well. Before I can cooperate and collaborate with someone or a group with whom I'm in conflict, I have to know a lot about them. I also have to teach them a lot about myself. And in some cases, the first step on this is asking myself about myself. What are the things I need to understand about my own interests that I can then teach the other side? They go through the same process. At this point, we're going to work together to find a possible solution. This can be a lot more effective than competition, but it's typically far more difficult. It takes a lot more work. This is sometimes hard to convince people to do, especially if you perceive yourself as being the one who will win in a competition. I have the most power. It's often very tempting to simply force your interests on those of the other group. In organizations, that can have long-term impact. That can reduce social cohesiveness within the organization. It can damage their ability to be competitive and effective in the future. So rather than letting people compete, it's often worth it for managers, even managers with great power who could enforce their will, it's often worth it to encourage a cooperative, collaborative approach. Both of these approaches involve negotiation. They involve one side proposing an alternative, the other side accepting it, rejecting it, countering with another alternative. In competition, we usually have a set of two alternatives, and then we simply fight it out which alternative is accepted. In collaboration and cooperation, we may go through iterative stages where we gradually go back and forth with each side proposing, accepting or not accepting elements of that proposal until we finally arrive at a solution that both sides can support. So both sides require negotiation, but cooperative, collaborative conflict resolution requires quite a bit more, which is one of the reasons it takes longer and is much more difficult to do. Now, it's easy to see the benefits of cooperative, collaborative agreements. However, it's also easy to perceive just how difficult they can be, and sometimes we simply can't seem to directly negotiate our way to a resolution to a conflict. In that case, it's common to reach outside of the disputing teams or groups or individuals to find a third party, a disinterested third party, which really means someone we can both trust. Both sides trust this person because they're perceived as not having an interest in the conflict. They're not part of it. They don't have close relationships with one group versus another. They're outsiders. To go back to our sports metaphor, these are referees, they're umpires, they're game officials. They're people who don't have an association with either team and are brought in to resolve conflict because they can be disinterested. And there's a couple of ways in which a third party, a disinterested third party, can help you reach a resolution to a really intractable conflict. And of course, these are important pieces of vocabulary that you'll need to know. The first one, arbitration. Arbitration is when that third party leads both groups through a resolution process. They essentially go through a negotiating process where they hold each group accountable for providing alternatives and responding to one another's proposals. But in the end, when all is said, that third party arbitrator has the ability to bind both groups to a resolution. This person acts like a judge in a court who listens to both sides, but then says, this is how it will be, and both sides must comply with that guidance. Arbitration is a very powerful form of conflict resolution. It typically requires both groups to agree to arbitration and to the selection of the arbitrator before the process begins. Once the process is begun, you've essentially handed your fate to that third-party arbitrator. You then treat them much as you would treat a judge in court. Arbitration is popular in a lot of situations where there are strong legal relationships. Unions and management teams negotiating about labor benefits often go into arbitration. Businesses that are conducting partnerships with other businesses who suspect there may be strong disagreements and the need for conflict resolution, but who don't want to take it to court with all the expenses involved with actual legal proceedings, may contract an arbitration clause. They may agree in advance, even before they have a disagreement, that if we have this kind of disagreement, we will submit it to arbitration. It's interesting, if you're good at this kind of conflict resolution and you like it, there are jobs as professional arbitrators, people who provide these services. So arbitration, the third party leads you through the process, and then that third party can tell both sides what they must do. They can bind both groups to a resolution. Now, the idea is that this third party arbitrator seeks a balance. They seek justice between the two. They contact both organizations. They have a great deal of communication both ways, but in the end, they will make a decision and then communicate it back to those, and everybody accepts or agrees to accept that particular decision. The other form of third-party conflict resolution is called mediation. Mediation is a softer, gentler approach. In mediation, the mediator plays a similar role to the arbitrator in that they lead both groups through a resolution process. They manage the process of proposal and counter-proposal. They encourage both groups and assist both groups in understanding the positions and the opinions of the others, with the expectation that this will help each group arrive at their own win-win solution and be able to resolve the conflict themselves. But the difference between mediation and arbitration, the arbitrator can bind. Mediation, that mediator has no authority, no power to decide the outcome. They're simply in the middle, but the individual groups themselves retain their power to agree or not to agree on a solution. It's an important vocabulary word difference. So, when I'm trying to get to a resolution of a conflict, step one, I always need to understand the other side's position. Why do they want what they want? What are their motivations? What are they afraid of? What are they attracted by? What do they seek? What are their interests? I also need to think about my position. What is it that I want? What do I really want? What do I want less than that? What do I not care about at all? And I need to decide how I want to work toward a resolution style. Do I want to attempt to be competitive and to get as much of my way as I possibly can? Or am I willing to be more cooperative and collaborative? So, first step, when I'm doing this, I need to set priorities. What do I really want? What do I care about less? What can I give up? And what can I absolutely not give up? In politics and in some negotiating situations, we hear people talk about red lines. You can't cross this red line. That is something that I cannot give up under any circumstances. And if I can't get that, then there cannot be a resolution to this conflict. Other things that are not red line, other things that are less important, I may be willing to give those up to serve the interests of my opponents, if in fact that helps me get the things that are most important to me. When I'm negotiating, when I'm thinking through conflict resolution, I need to control my emotions and be very rational. When emotions get into these kinds of negotiations, they muddy the water, they make it hard for people to understand each other, they generate more heat than light. So be prepared to control your emotions. And just because you disagree with someone is no reason to be angry with them. And even if you decide you have a reason to be angry with them, don't. It's not going to help the situation at all. And then again, think carefully about your conflict resolution style. If you have enough power to force a competitive resolution to get the winner and allow your opponent to lose, that's a strategy you might consider, but be aware of the long-term consequences. If you don't have enough power, then your only option is a more collaborative approach. So there's some conflict resolution styles, some things to think about. And this will lead to another set of vocabulary words. Very competitive styles involve something called high assertion and low cooperation. I'm competitive, I want to win, and I don't care if my opponent loses. I'm very assertive, I'm very demanding, I'm very aggressive, and I place a very low value on cooperation. The strongest will survive, the strongest will win, and that's gotta be me. The opposite of this is called an accommodating style. I'm not aggressive. I'm really seeking more friendly, sustainable conflict resolution, and I'm willing to give up a lot of my own interests in order to get it. So I'm low on assertion, and I'm really high on cooperation. This is often a person who is thinking very long-term about the organization's needs, as opposed to the interests of two opposing groups in the short term. An avoider, someone who is engaged in avoiding, I'm pretty much low on assertion and I'm low on cooperation. I really don't think this conflict is important to resolve. I don't want to have anything to do with it, and I'm distancing myself from it. I'm avoiding these discussions because I find them unpleasant. This is typically a very ineffective management approach when it comes to conflict resolution. Now, collaborating. I'm very high on assertion and I'm high on cooperation. What this really means is I really, really want resolution to this conflict, and I'm willing to do what it takes. If I can resolve it one way, I will. If I can resolve it the other way, I'll do that. But I'm strongly focused on both approaches, and I'm open to whatever my opponent would propose as well. Compromising is kind of a watered-down version of collaborating. I'm very moderate on both those things. The difference between collaborating and compromising is typically not my interest in a particular style, but it's on my value for a resolution for the conflict overall. So when I'm trying to figure out how to resolve a conflict as a manager, always think win-win. Always ask yourself, can I resolve this in a collaborative, cooperative way that gives both sides at least some win? If I can, it's usually worth doing it. If I cannot arrive at that, ask if arbitration or mediation will help me arrive at that. And then sometimes if I simply can't make any of those work, or I don't have the time to go through that lengthy process, then the competitive model is my only choice, and I'm forced to simply let one side win and the other side lose. Don't do that if you can avoid it. That has a long-term degradative effect on most organizations. Okay, this is a quick look at the vocabulary and the approaches for conflict resolution. I would strongly encourage you to read the material associated with this unit, review the questions with this unit and attempt to answer them yourself. And if you're at all confused about any aspect of conflict resolution or the important vocabulary words associated with it, I would encourage you to review this video as often as you like.